Hello, 8th grade. Welcome to another Jomic edition of the novel Johnny Tremain. This is the Chapter 4 edition of Johnny Tremain. Chapter 4 is titled The Rising Eye. It begins on page 75 in the blue book with the picture of the fat man to the left. Before we begin reading part 1 of Chapter 4, as always, I will ask you several questions to think about while we read, while you're listening, and while you're reading along with me. Here's the first question. In what business is Mr. Light? Number 2, how is Johnny received by Mr. Light? That means, how does Mr. Light treat him? And number 3, in what ways, because there are several ways, in what ways does Forbes portray Johnny's arrogance in this chapter? And so we begin Chapter 4, The Rising Eye, Part 1. It was past dawn when he woke, his feeling of contentment still in him. He was no longer his own problem, but Merchant Light's. Tomorrow at this time, what would he be calling him? Uncle Jonathan? Cousin Light? Perhaps Grandpa? And he laughed out loud. Only imagine how Mrs. Lapham would come running, dropping nervous curtsies when he drove up in that ruby coach. How Madge and Dorcas would stare. First thing he did would be to take Scylla for a drive. He'd not even invite Isana. But how she would bawl when left behind. And then his imagination jumped ahead. At the Charlestown ferry slip, he washed in the cold sea water, and because the sun was warm, sunned himself as he did what he could to make his shabby clothes presentable. He combed his lank, fair hair with his fingers, cleaned his nails with his teeth. Of course, now he could buy Scylla that pony and cart. And Grandpa Lapham? Oh, he'd buy him a Bible with print an inch high in it. Mrs. Lapham? Not a thing, madam, not one thing. Christ's Church said 10 o'clock. He got up and started for Long Wharf, where his great relative had his counting house. On his way, he passed down Salt Lane. There was the comical little painted man, observing Boston through his tiny spyglass. Johnny wanted to stop, tell that fellow, that Rab, of his great connections, but decided to wait until he was sure of his welcome into the Light family. Although half of him was leaping ahead, imagining great things for himself, the other half was wary. It was quite possible he would get no welcome at all, and he knew it. He walked half the length of Long Wharf until he saw carved over a door the familiar rising eye. The door was open, but he knocked. None of the 3 clerks, sitting on their high stools with their backs to him, scratching in ledgers, looked up. So he stepped inside. Now that he had to speak, he found there was a barrier across his throat, something that he would have to struggle to get his voice over. He was more excited than he had realized, but he was scornful too. These 3 clerks would not even look up when he came in today, but tomorrow what would it be? Good morning, little master. I'll tell your uncle, cousin, grandfather, that you are here, sir. Finally, a well-fed, rosy youth, keeping one finger in his ledger, swung around and asked him what he wanted. It is a personal matter between myself and Mr. Light. Well, said the young man pleasantly, even if it is personal, you'd better tell me what it is. It is a family matter. I cannot, in honor, tell anyone except Mr. Light. One of the elderly clerks laughed in a mean way. Just another poor suitor for the hand of Miss Lavinia. The young clerk flushed. Johnny had seen enough of Madge and Dorcas and their suitors to know that the jibe about poor boys aspiring to Miss Lavinia had gone home. Tell him, snickered the other ancient spider of a clerk, that Mr. Light is,
Sensible of the great honor, and regrets to say he has formed other plans for his daughter's future. Ah,
Evidently, he mimicked Mr. Light. The young clerk was scarlet. He flung down his pen. "Can't you ever forget that?" he protested. "Here, kid." And he turned to Johnny. "Mr. Light's closeted behind that door with two of his sea captains. When they leave, you just walk in." Johnny sat modestly on a stool, his arrogant, shabby hat in his good hand, and looked about him. The three backs were bent once more over the ledgers. The quill pens scratched. He heard the gritting of sand as they blotted their pages. There was a handsome half-model of a ship on the wall. Sea chests, doubtless full of charts, maps, invoices, were under the desks. The door opened. Two ruddy men with swaying walks stepped out, and Mr. Light himself was shaking hands, bidding them success on their voyaging, and God's mercy. As he turned to go back to his sanctuary, Johnny followed him. Mr. Light sat himself in a red leather armchair beside an open window. Through that window he could watch his western star graving in the graving dock. He would have been a handsome man, with his fine dark eyes, bushy black brows, contrasting smartly with the white tie wig he wore, except for the color and quality of his flesh. It was as yellow as tallow. Seemingly it had melted and run down. The lids were heavy over the remarkable eyes. The melted flesh made pouches beneath them. It hung down along his jawbone, under his jutting chin. "What is it?" he demanded. "Who let you in? What do you want? And who, for heaven's sake, are you?" "Sir," said Johnny Tremain, "I'm Jonathan Light Tremain." There was a long pause. The merchant's glittering black eyes did not waver, nor the tallow cheeks redden. If the name meant anything to him, he did not show it. "Well?" "My mother, sir." The boy's voice shook slightly. "She told me, she always said—" Mr. Light opened his jeweled snuff box, took snuff, sneezed, and blew his nose. "I can go on from there, boy. Your mother on her deathbed told you you were related to the rich Boston merchant?" Johnny was sure now Mr. Light knew of the relationship. "Yes, sir, she did. But I didn't know you'd know." "No! I didn't need to know. It is a very old story, a very old trick, and you will be gone, and will you be gone, or shall I have you flung out?" "I'll stay," Johnny said stubbornly. "Seawall!" The merchant did not raise his voice, but instantly the young clerk was on his threshold. "Show him out, Seawall, and happens he lands in the water, you can baptize him with my name." Mr. Light took up a handful of papers. The incident was over. Seawall looked at Johnny, and Johnny at Seawall. The young man was as kind as his cherubic face suggested. "I can prove you one thing, Mr. Light. My name is Jonathan Light Tremain." "What of it? Any back-alley drabtail can name her child for the greatest men in the colony. There should be a law against it. But there is none." Johnny's temper began to go. "You flatter yourself. What have you ever done except be rich? Why, I thought even a monkey mother would name a monkey child after you." Mr. Light gave a long whistle. "That was quite a mouthful. Seawall?" "Yes, sir." "You just take this monkey child of a monkey mother out and drown it." "Yes, sir." Seawall put a soft hand on the boy's shoulder, but Johnny fiercely shook himself free. "I don't want your money," he said, more proudly than accurately. "Now that I've met you face to face, I don't much fancy you as kin." "Your manners, my boy, are a credit to your mother. But facts are facts, and I have a cup with your arms on it to prove what I say is true. The merchant's unhealthy, brilliant eyes quivered and glittered. You've got a cup of mine? No, of mine. So, you've got a cup. Will you describe it? Johnny described it as only a silversmith could. Why, Mr. Light, that must be... Sewall began, but Mr. Light hushed him. Evidently not only Mr. Light, but his clerks had heard of this cup. Johnny was elated. My boy, said the merchant, you have, brought me great news. I must see your cup. Any time you say, sir. My long-lost cup, returned to me by my long-lost little... whatever you are. He had taken more snuff. Bring your cup to me tonight. You know my Beacon Hill house. Yes, sir. And we'll kill the fatted calf, you long-lost whatever you are. Come an hour after candles are lit. Prodigal son, what? Got a cup, has he?